So I want to begin by some fairly basic questions, but I hope interesting ones. The Bible is scripture for Jews and for Christians. But precisely what do we mean by the Bible there? The Christian Bible contains both the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Jewish Bible is the Hebrew Scriptures, Now, the Jewish Scriptures, the Hebrew Scriptures, were inherited by the church, because this was the Bible of Jesus and Paul. And then early Christian writings were added to that by Christians to make up what is known as the Bible for Christians. These two parts are very different. They're very different in size. The Old Testament or Hebrew Bible is really rather large, and the New Testament rather small. Some people joke about the appendix, by which they mean the New Testament. Also, very different in the nature of the material. The Jewish Scriptures are the library of a nation over a 1,000-year period, massively divergent. So in there you've got laws, you've got erotic poetry, you've got narrative history, all kinds of things thrown in there from a nation's history, from its library for a millennium. Whereas the New Testament, I think we could say, is essentially sectarian literature from a small group generated over a couple of generations. Very, very different.
We're going to have to get through 500 years and very quickly. This will be a very rough guide to the Christianization of the Caribbean. So a couple of things about context in terms of mission. First of all, we know that when Columbus, or as they call him where I come from, Jamaica, they call him Christopher Columbus, they call him Christopher Come Bust Us, to give you a sense of what took place over there, the genocide of the Amerindians, enslavement and brutalization of African people. There was always a question of metaphysics in mind for Columbus. Namely, he wanted to know whether these people were fully human. If they're fully human, can they be made a profit out of? Can they be commodified? In his diaries, he writes about plants, animals, Indians. They're commodities to be utilized. And the third question is, can they be saved? And this debate rumbles on until the 1550s. There's a big debate, discussion that takes place, isn't face-to-face within Spain, between Sepúlveda and Las Casas. Sepúlveda arguing that the Indians are barbaric and they can't be civilized, and therefore the best that we can do is colonize them and use them as we see fit. Las Casas saying, no, that's not the case. The Indians are of value, they have a will, and they can be Christianized, and therefore you should not brutalize them. Note, the focus is on the Indians. 30 years prior, Las Casas says, spare the Indians and send in the Africans. Let the Africans do the hard work and labor. So while the Indians are being catered for in terms of attempting to ameliorate their suffering, no such provision is made for the Africans. So we have a question to be resolved in colonial Christianity about what do we do with the Africans? What do we do with their souls? If they are human, then how do we go about the business of saving them, yet ensuring that the mission of the colonialists, the need to extract profit, takes place? There's a tension there.
As Professor Joyce, I'm sure, will have said, the Book of Lamentations consists of 5 poems. These poems are very artfully written. The content is a lamentation, or are indeed 5 lamentations, 5 separate lamentations, about the destruction of Jerusalem at the hand of the Babylonians in 587-86 BCE. And indeed, both Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed after what, from today's perspective, can only be described as rather disastrous policy decisions by the Judean kings whose capital Jerusalem was at the time. Now, each of these lamentations can be read on its own. They are complete poems, they don't need each other, but together they do form a wider arc, you could say. Now, about the artfulness of these poems, well, the first 4 of these are written in what we call acrostic. And indeed, they're written in a very particular form of acrostic, namely alphabetic acrostic. An acrostic is a poem in which the first letter of each line is somehow important. In an alphabetic acrostic, such as Lamentations 1, 1 to 4 example, the first letter of each line is Well, it describes the sequence of the alphabet. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, and it goes till the end, Tav. So each line has one letter of the alphabet and goes through. People do different things with acrostics. For example, this lovely little poem. Can anybody tell me what is written in it? This is a piece of brilliant British literary history. Well, what we see here is Alice Liddell's name. She has a rather unusual middle name, Pleasance. But this kind of thing happens a lot in literature.
Some basic differences between Freudian and object relations theory, and this is very, very simplified, but just to give us a feel. For Freud, the ages between 3 and 5 are really crucial in child development, and that's when the Oedipus complex is happening. In object relations theory, it's early infancy that is crucial. In Freud, you can't get much more patriarchal than Freud. There's a focus on the father and an obsession with the phallus. In object relations theory, the focus is on the mother, and there is an interest in the breast and the significance of the breast as nurturing. Behaviour arises from hedonistic instincts and drives in Freudian theory. On the other hand, in object relations theory, behaviour is organised around self and other relationships. And Sutti's particular brand of early object relations theory really focused on the love bond between the mother and the child. So Sutti applies his psychoanalytic framework to understanding religion. He approaches it not from an anthropological or a cultural or historical perspective, but in terms of intrapsychic processes. And he argues that disturbing aspects of early parental relationships, particularly jealousy, are played out, managed, and become institutionalized in adult religion. On the basis of ethnographic studies, he identified two sharply contrasting types of religion: cults of father gods and cults of mother goddesses. Father god cults, which are typical of patriarchal societies, are characterized by two sorts of jealousy: the male's jealousy of the female's capacity to reproduce, and the son's jealousy of the father. These jealousies are managed by animal blood sacrificial rites that mimic the blood of childbearing, but from which women are always excluded. According to Sutti, in mother goddess cults, on the other hand, which are more typical of matrifocal societies, the jealousy is that of siblings in competition with each other for the nurture of their mother. As mother goddesses tend to be associated with the earth, sacrifices in these sorts of cults are the fruits of the earth: vegetables, cereals, cooked meats. However, from time to time, human, often infant sacrifices may be required.
So, the Bible and Dante's Divine Comedy. Very brief introduction to Dante. You've got his dates there. Late medieval Italian poet. He didn't just write the Divine Comedy, although the Divine Comedy is his most significant work. The Divine Comedy is a striking, inspiring, and controversial work. And it is, I think, a unique resource for exploring what the AKC booklet refers to as the multiple imaginative and creative possibilities generated by the biblical texts. I think Dante would be very pleased to be part of this AKC series. The comedy was written at the beginning of the 14th century, over a period of about 14 or 15 years. It tells the story of Dante's journey through the afterlife, through hell, purgatory, and paradise. And the three realms correspond to the three different parts of the poem: Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, hell, purgatory, and paradise. The Divine Comedy is thought to be, after the Bible, the most commented upon text in Western culture. And at different points in history, the way the comedy was interpreted and commented upon looked not too dissimilar from the way that the Bible was commented upon. A moment of particular influence for Dante's work was in 19th century England, and we owe to that period here in England of reception of Dante's work, we owe to that in significant measure the status that Dante's comedy still has today as a work of literature, as a work of art. So one of the reasons why this might be important for us to bear in mind, just as a historical connection, is that this is the time that King's starts. This is the time the AKC starts. So Dante is very much part of that culture, that historical moment.
My topic is St. Paul in film and on TV. Now, the Apostle Paul makes, undoubtedly, a massive contribution to the New Testament. We have 13 letters in the New Testament that bear his name, and they are arranged broadly speaking, in order of length. So the longest comes first in its canonical order, so beginning with Romans and then ending with the shortest letter, Philemon. In a book published in 2005, the author Richard Walsh found only 2 movies listed in the Internet Movie Database in which Paul figured. One was an Italian movie called San Paolo, which was released in 2000, and then the other is the better-known film by Martin Scorsese, The Last Temptation of Christ, which was released in 1988. The reasons that Paul hasn't figured so much on TV or film are actually much more mundane. One is it's hard to deal with Paul without getting into a complex and really quite inconclusive debate about his relationship with Jesus. The question has often been framed in terms of, was Paul, rather than Jesus, the true founder of Christianity? And of course, that's a sensitive issue, but it's also a complicated issue to explore in terms of scholarship.
Well, the question I put as a sort of opening one for us is not particularly about art or visual art at all. It's about the sort of text that the Bible is, and especially the sort of text that it is for Jews and Christians in the way that they use it, and have done historically for many hundreds of years. Both Judaism and Christianity have very long traditions of seeing the Bible or the scriptural text, the texts that make up the Bible, as the start of a conversation. In a way, it's a conversation between God and human beings. Some parts of the Bible more obviously so than others. There are parts of the Bible where God speaks, or God's words are recorded, and there is an interaction between a particular character in the biblical narrative and the voice of God. We might think of the burning bush and Moses being instructed by God to go and announce that Pharaoh is to liberate the Israelites from captivity, for example, and Abraham often actually arguing with God in order to apparently change God's mind. So those are just some examples of many occasions in the Bible where we see a conversation, as it were, embedded already within the scriptural text.
This great text, one of the smallest books in the whole Bible, known in Hebrew as Echa, how, usually called in English Lamentations, traditionally associated with Jeremiah. Traditionally, some have thought he wrote it, but it seems to be from the same era, which is the crisis wherein the Babylonians destroyed the Jerusalem temple in about 586, 587 BCE, before the Common Era. Very short book with 5 poetic laments, and they are very like the laments of the Psalms. The Psalms have individual and collective laments. I appeal to God, we appeal to God. And this book has similarly, chapter 3 is in the first person singular voice. I am the man, it starts. We'll come back to that. Chapter 5 is we. We appeal to God. Very similar to the range of laments in the Psalms.
Well, Wozzeck, as you can see, it was composed between 1914 and 1922, quite important years. He was a tremendous musician and a great pupil and follower of somebody you might have heard of, Arnold Schoenberg, who's notorious as the inventor of 12-tone or atonal music, the kind of 20th century music that most people run a mile from. But Berg's opera is the one great work and opera that really took off and became a great popular success from that school. But what caught my eye was actually a review of a recent production of Wozzeck by the English National Opera. This is what he thinks of Wozzeck. A tragedy without hope or salvation. Neither Berg's opera Wozzeck or Buchner's original play offer anything to purge or console an audience. It's a pretty harrowing night in the theatre. Now, Rupert Christensen sums up the opera very briefly for us. A poor man is driven mad and murders his common-law wife who has cheated on him. He then kills himself. Their young son is left playing alone, innocent of what has occurred, but surely doomed to drudge the same path of exploitation and deprivation as his parents if he survives. The world is pitiless, and if there is a God, he does not hear us. it could hardly be more bleak. I'm really selling this to you, aren't I? The bleakest of stories and completely incomprehensible 12-tone music. What more would you like to pay 75 quid for at the ENO? And then he goes on to talk about the new production. Carrie Cracknell's powerful new production of Berg's desolate masterpiece translates the opera from early 19th century Germany into modern Britain. And it's quite interesting because it really is, Wozzeck in the story is a soldier brutalized by war. And she updates it into something like a post-traumatic stress kind of view, looking at the impact of these awful experiences and how that comes back domestically, often with dreadful consequences. Although I can buy some of Cracknell's liberties with Buchner's text, there are significant dimensions which she can't accommodate. So she's brought it up into the modern day, and we can't bring everything, however, because, as he says, Christianity defines Wozzeck and Marie's moral boundaries. The two characters, working class, depressed, absolutely at the bottom of their lives, turn to the Bible. His unanswered search for a deity and her Bible reading scarcely ring true in terms of today's values. That's interesting. The thing an opera critic finds hard is to see someone read the Bible on the opera stage and see that as a convincing part of the modern world. I mean, when was the last time, again, I'm not wanting to presume anything, you saw a character on EastEnders reading the Bible when they had a crisis of conscience?